In this video, we're going to model a clothes hanger using Fusion 360 Forms. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to do something a little different, but kind of the same. Now, we've used forms to model all kinds of different things. Obviously, car parts, we've done a helmet, we've done earbuds, we've done a golf club, we've done all kinds of different things. But this was an interesting request that came in, modeling a wooden clothes hanger. So something that has a lot of curvature and shape to it, but also has some flat faces. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore the Forms workspace and we're going to model a hanger. And we're going to talk about some of the things that we do after the fact so that we can get flat faces, but also have curves and blends and things like that. So if you want to start with this file, you can go to the description of the video and you can download it. Really all it is a triangle sketch, and then it's got this little hook piece on the top. So you can model that on your own. You can follow along if you want. But what we're going to do is we're going to use the Forms tools and we're going to try to figure out how we can model something like this. So to get started, the first thing with Forms, if you haven't seen any of the other Forms videos, is you always want to think about the starting shape. Now we talked about this with the golf club. And in that case, we ended up using, I believe it was a quad ball, but we have to really think about the shapes that we're using and how we want to build our designs. So what we're going to do is we're going to build something that's symmetric, at least at the start, and we're going to use the symmetry plane to make sure that we are keeping that symmetry, kind of prevent us from over modeling the thing. But we still want to avoid things like the sphere, which closes up at a single point at the top, or the cylinder, which closes up at a single point at the top. However, if we are using that mirror functionality, something like a cylinder might be a good option. It really depends on the shape that you're working with. And what I mean by that is we can extrude and we can build the cylinder out to make the shape of the hanger that we want. But the specific one that I'm talking about probably is more in line with the box shape. So we're going to start with the box shape and we're going to learn how to use that to make our hanger. So I'm going to start with box. I am going to begin on what is my right plane, and that is going to be my XY plane. And then I'm going to draw this thing just centered at the origin, and this is going to sort of be our starting shape. We're going to pull it in, make sure that we do have symmetry, and we want to make sure that we have length symmetry. I'm going to set this to make sure that we are going about the origin. So you can see we started at the origin. That green line is right where we want it, and that's going to work just fine. If you want to have symmetry front and back, you can also add width symmetry and height symmetry depending on your design. In this case, all we really care about is length. I'm not really too worried about any of the other parameters because it's all going to get changed. The next thing that I want to do is instantly change this to box display, which is going to be Alt and 1 on the keyboard. You can also go to display mode and change it here. I'm going to move this entire thing using modify, edit form, and I'm just going to push it back. It doesn't have to be symmetric here, but I'm just going to go ahead and push it back to roughly at the origin. Looks like minus 0.75 will get me there. Then left click to deselect it. Now that we have this box shape, what we want to do is we want to push it up towards our hook and begin sort of designing this. So I'm going to take the entire thing once more and just bring it up until it looks about right. Doesn't have to be perfect, but I am going to make sure that I embed that hook in there a little bit so that way it's got a nice overlap. Now the point where we have to start changing the shape. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to take this left side and I'm going to rotate it and then move it in plane. Now the reason I'm doing that is because what I'm looking to do with my sketch that I have underneath here is I'm looking to maintain a parallel relationship, at least at the start right now, with the edges of my form. So that means that this edge here, I want to be essentially perpendicular to that line. And it doesn't have to be perfect, we're only doing this visually, but that's essentially my starting point. Now, there is currently a potential issue with forms. If I use Alt and 1 and Alt and 3 to go back and forth between box and smooth display, it's actually going to change the dialog here. So you have to left click in the canvas area to deselect, and then you can go back and forth between smooth and box display. So you can see here what we have is we've kind of got the starting shape here for our hanger. You will notice that these edges, when I go to smooth display, but I've got these edges that are kind of floating out here. When I go back to box display, well, I can't do that because I have to deselect it again. But if I go back to box display, there is an extra set of edges here that we're not seeing. So this is a potential problem because in smooth display, we have these edges here, and then we've got this sort of rollover that happens. So if I take a look at this edge and I go back to my selection options and I go to box display, I essentially have two sets of edges that are overlapping each other. And this is very easy to happen. It happens quite a bit when you start manipulating forms, and it's something that you need to be very careful with. So what I'm going to do is go to smooth display, and I'm going to get out of edit form. I'm going to double click on this edge and hit delete. Now I know that doesn't look very appealing, but this gets rid of those extra edges. Now I don't have to worry about double edges here. If I start to move this, you can see we've only got the one set of edges. So Control Z to undo that move. Now what we have to do is we have to think about how we're going to build this shape. Right now, what we have is just essentially this melted looking square, right? We've just kind of moved a few things around. A couple things that are going to happen. We have to think about the shape in this right view. We also have to think about the shape in the top view because it's going to taper in and taper back out. So again, I like to model in box display. So Alt and 1, I'm going to make sure that I do that. And then I need to extrude some geometry. Now at this point, we've got faces on the end, which kind of complicates the process. But what we can do is we can delete them if we don't want them right now, or we can select them and extrude them. So if I select all of these faces and then I hold Alt down to extrude them, what we're doing is we're essentially taking those faces and we're pulling them out. If I go to smooth display, we don't have any overlapping edges. So this is perfectly fine. A lot of times what I'll do is I will delete those faces because then it lets me double click the edge and grab the entire edge. We have to be careful about our selection. It's always going to matter. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make sure that I'm kind of following the shape, but we are going to slightly taper down. And then once more, I'm going to extrude one more time, hold down Alt, and you'll notice that this doesn't work. Now the reason this doesn't work is because when we box select, we're also getting edges, and we can't extrude the edges and the faces together. So you either need to manually select those faces or go to your selection priorities and filters and only select T-spline faces, and that will allow you to do the box selection. I typically work with edges instead of faces, so I generally don't turn off those selection filters. But sometimes if you're modeling designs like this, it'll be very helpful to be able to play around with this. All right, so smooth display, this is what our hanger looks like. It's not very appealing yet. It doesn't look very good, but we're not even close to being done. Right now, we don't need the sketch anymore, but what we do need to consider is the shape. So back to box display, I'm going to view this from the top. Now at the very top, it's going to be a bit wider, so I'm going to double click that edge, and I'm going to scale it in the X direction. So it's going to make that wider there. And then I'm going to left click, then go to Alt 3 to check the smooth display. So you can see it's nice and wide there, and go back to box display. I'm going to take this one, I'm going to scale this one in the X direction. So all we're doing is we're changing the shape in X. We're taking this exact box shape and we're scaling it down in X. Once again, smooth display, you can see that we've kind of added a bit of geometry there. Next, we're going to do this from another view. I think it's very important when you're trying to get these visual references that you really think about the orientation that you're working in. So now I'm going to select this, and this is a bit tricky because when we were scaling it horizontally or in the X direction from the top, it didn't really matter that we weren't in line here. But now if I try to scale this down vertically, it's going to start twisting it, and that might not be the result I want. We can scale down in plane, which will be Y and Z, and notice that it moves it a little bit, which is okay. And I'm going to do that again here. I'm going to scale that down, making it a bit wider at the end. So we're going to rotate this around and maybe take this one and scale it horizontally in the X a bit more just to give it a bit more shape. Next, I'm going to select these upper faces. I need to select them across the center. I want to make sure that I get everything. I'm going to hold down Alt and extrude this up to add a bit more geometry. And with that face selected, I'm going to scale it down in the Y direction and then scale it down in X, sort of taper it a bit. And you'll notice that, again, that doesn't look very good. It's bulging up quite a bit. Now, a couple ways that we can fix this is we can flatten that geometry. So if we take these edges here, we can pull them up to try to flatten it. And when we look at this, you can see that it's starting to sort of flatten out. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to roughly build the shape, and then we're going to cut it later with a sketch. We want the top to be perfectly flat. So all we really care about is that we're getting roughly the right shape, and it doesn't have to be perfect. So I think that looks okay. And we're gonna go ahead and cut that away after we're done. Some other things that we want to do is we want to change the way in which this bottom section turns. So we need to add some more geometry. The way that I'm going to do that is by going to a command called Insert Edge. We're going to double click on an edge. So let's go ahead and make sure that we're grabbing this entire loop here. I'm going to use a single insertion mode and just drag it down about halfway. It doesn't have to be perfect. Make sure that it is simple, and we'll say OK. Now the simple insertion mode will put the edges exactly where you say where you want them. In this case, about halfway, minus 0.53, I think is what we did. But the thing that's important is that these vertices don't remain in a straight line, because this is going to affect our curvature, and it's not what we want. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. Then I'm going to take this edge here, and we're going to rotate this and just move it down a little bit. So when we take a look at this at Smooth Display, you can see we're starting to get that sort of transition, that arc shape. I'm probably going to do a bit more work in this corner. So let's rotate it just a little bit more, maybe bring it down. We can move this one up a bit. And again, take a look. It's looking okay. I think I want to scale this in a bit in this direction and probably add another edge. So with that edge selected, I'm going to go to Insert Edge, go back to Box Display, because again, we want to make sure that we don't have just a flat section here. And I'm going to scale this one out a little bit. I'm going to go to my right-hand view. You can double click your mouse wheel, the scroll wheel, to zoom to fit. And then I'm going to scale this one out just a little bit and move it up. So what I'm looking at here is the transition, or the change in angle for these outside edges and the change in angle for these inside edges. So when I look at this, you can see we've got that wider outside section, so it would be like the shoulder of a shirt. And then we have the sort of transitions here. Now, at this point, I'm going to use Control and 4 on my keyboard. You can also go to your display settings and go just to shaded. What this does is it's going to hide my edges, and just take a look at the shape. See if you're happy with the shape that you're getting. Now, this shape has some tighter transitions on it. Control and 6 will bring those edges back. You can also go to Visual Style, Shaded with Visible Edges. And I think that I made a mistake here. I want to widen this out a little bit and maybe move it just a little bit. And I think I want to add some more control in this area. So I'm going to double click that midsection. I'm going to go to Insert Edge. Single doesn't really matter because we have symmetry. It's going to automatically add one to the other side. And then in Box Display, remember, we want to make sure that it's not flat. So we're going to use Modify, Edit Form. We're going to bring that up a little bit. Maybe take both of these, pull them up just a hair, and then see what that looks like. I think this section is probably a bit too wide. So again, what we want to do is we want to take the entire thing. So I'm going to go to a top view, take this entire edge, and I'm going to scale it in. I'm going to take the next entire edge, double clicking, and scale that in a bit. And then this one here, I'm probably going to scale that in just a little bit. It's only going to be the top just because it's not a complete loop, because we have what's called a star point here. But then let's take a look at this in Smooth Display. So I think everything there looks okay. Remember, we are going to make some cuts to the top. We're not too worried about it being the final shape. And we are actually going to make some cuts to the bottom as well. But I think this looks pretty good so far. A couple other topics that I want to make sure that we capture here is that we want to understand how to control the curvature. So right now, if I hide the edges, we essentially just have the transitions are pretty tight, but that's just based off of the geometry that we're working with. If we want those to be a bit softer, what we need to do is we need to change the shape of this edge. We need to give it a more gradual transition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this with vertex selection. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to select all of these vertices. I'm going to go to edit form. Remember, we have symmetry, so I don't have to select the ones on the other side. And what I want to do is I want to move my pivot point. So this set pivot point, I'm going to put down here, and then I'm going to scale this vertically. And scaling it vertically is going to bring down all of these other vertices relative to that point. So it's not going to make much of a difference down here at the bottom, or really any difference, but in the middle, it's going to soften that up. So if I rotate this around and I scale this down, you can see the middle section is getting very soft right in the middle, and down here it's staying relatively sharp. So this is a good way for us to control that transition. Now, if you want to make changes down here, obviously you can take that vertex and you can move it around. I suggest that you do this in box display mode and not necessarily do it manually in smooth display, because it can be very easy to sort of get this thing out of shape. Another thing that you want to think about is whether or not you need all of your edges. So in this case, I'm going to take this mid edge, and I think that I need it, so I'm going to scale it out just a little bit, and this is going to soften that shape once more. So we're going from a fairly hard transition and we're softening it up. So it's going to round out that shape and just give us a little bit more transition. But what if I wanted this right here to be a harder edge? So right now it's very visible, but what if I wanted it to be a harder edge or a harder transition? Well, the way that we do that is by inserting additional edges. Now, this gets a bit tricky simply because we want to avoid those flat sections because it's going to produce bad geometry. So we have to put an edge in here, and I'm going to put it relatively close. I'm going to say about 0.1 somewhere. And then I'm going to go to box display mode. I'm going to go to modify edit form. I'm going to take that entire edge that I added in there, and I'm just going to scale it out just a little bit. So if I click the scale in the X direction, I'm going to do 1.01 and just see what that looks like visually. If I go to my smooth display, Control and 4 to hide edges and rotate this thing around, you can see now we have a nice crisp edge. And that nice crisp edge carries all the way to the end. And really what I want is I want it to disappear down here, but I want to keep it up here. So the way that we get it to disappear is by transitioning the thickness of that edge, by transitioning it wider as we get further down. And in order to do that, we're going to use insert point. So we have a nice tight edge here. And as soon as we get here, what I want to do is I want to space it out. So I'm going to start clicking that point. I want to maintain the change in angle between these edges. If we click a red point, that's going to be the middle, and that's okay. I'm going to rotate this around, view it from, in this case, the left, essentially the back. And then what we want to do is we want to carry on from here, going up and coming back to this point. And once we have that, I'm going to double click this edge, which should grab everything that we want to replace and just hit delete on the keyboard. Now, if we take a look at this in smooth display, if I hide my edges, that tight transition should now begin to fade away. So it's relatively tight up here in the center, and as we get closer to the bottom, it sort of tapers away. So that's how we would control those edges in the edge flow. You can see that it's still tight on the back, and then right where we added those edges and we started to transition it, it starts to fade away. Now there is one more piece of this puzzle that we want to make sure that we explore, and that is going to be the utilities and make uniform. Now, make uniform is something that helps with star points, or essentially it's meant to help reduce tension in these star points, but it also has another effect. If we take a look at this in box display and then we go to smooth display, you'll notice that things like the length of this edge are different between the two. Now, when we run the utility make uniform, it's going to take those tight areas and space them out, and the big areas and contract them a little bit. Now, if we say okay, you can see that this edge got shorter, this one got a little bit longer. Now, it's important that we do run that because it helps us ensure that the surfaces we're creating have the least amount of tension, but it is also important to double check your shape. Make sure that the transitions that you wanted are still there. Now, because this is a clothes hanger, we would want all the transitions on the top to be relatively soft, and all the ones down here are really just more for a stylized feature. So if you want to make any changes to those, again, what we can do is we can add additional edges. Just for the purposes of this video, I am going to add another edge because I want to show how we can do this around the star point. So if we go to modify and insert edge, and I double click this edge, it's only going to go down to here. And that's because this is not an entire loop. What we're going to do is we're going to control the curvature we want on this edge, and then we're going to manually carry it on to the rest of the geometry. So I'm going to put it at about 0.25 and say, okay, I'm only going to do this to the front of the design, not the back, just because it's just an exercise really. I'm going to go to box display, and you can see what we have is we've got this edge here, and I want to make some adjustments before I continue to add additional edges. I'm going to view this from my right side, double click the mouse to bring it back, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit. Remember, we want to avoid having a completely flat section. Now, moving it up is going to produce some problems, but these are all things we're going to fix. The problem that happens is we have what's called a T-point. This T-point is when one edge ends in the middle of another edge. And that's okay in Fusion 360 forms, but as soon as we start manipulating that geometry, the surfaces that we get in that area can oftentimes be problematic. Now, when we take a look at this, it doesn't look too bad, but it's always a good idea for us to really think about the curvature and manually control it whenever possible. So I'm going to use insert point, and I'm going to bring a point up to here and just take it over to that midline and say okay. And once again, we don't want a complete flat section, so I am going to go to my right view and just make sure that I add a little bit of curvature. So you can see that there is a consistent width between these edges, and then it gets a little bit thicker down there at the bottom, which is okay for now. And then I'm going to take a look at this in smooth display, Control 4 to hide my edges. You can see now we've got that tighter transition on the front, and we've got the softer transition on the back. One could be the front, one could be the back, it doesn't really matter. However, we're not quite done yet. And the reason we're not quite done yet is because we have this T-point to deal with. Now, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You can have a T-point if you want. But again, I like to make sure that I'm controlling this geometry as best I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this edge all the way to the other side. I'm going to go to box display. And once again, I want to make sure that I have a little bit of curvature here. I want to make sure that it's not completely flat. So I'm going to pull that down and maybe bring this vertex back just a little bit. And now we have to deal with the issue on the inside. Now, what we did originally was we took an edge. Now we went from here, I'm going to control double click. And this time I don't want a tight transition. I want it to be a bit wider. So I'm going to bring this all the way down to about 0.5. I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to scale it down because I want to make sure, again, what we're doing is that we are maintaining, we're going to pull this out just to give a little bit of curvature. We're maintaining that smooth transition. I don't want to add another creased edge. And once we do that, all that's left is to connect these 2 points. So once again, we'll go to insert point, here to here, hit enter. Make sure that we have at least a little bit of curvature here. So this is going to be that one vertex. I'm going to go to my side view and maybe pull that out just a little bit, and then take a look at this in smooth display. So once again, Control and 4 to hide the edges. So now you can see that we've got a tighter transition up here. We've got a tight transition here that fades away. And underneath, even though we added those edges, we don't really have a hard transition except for right in the middle where it goes. It's basically this hard edge that goes right between the middle, but that's okay. So at this point, that is basically the shape that I'm going for. However, this is not the end of the story. So what we need to do now is we need to convert this to a solid body because it's completely closed, and then make some additional changes. So I'm going to finish the form. You'll notice that we get some edges on the design, but those are just based on the conversion. If I hit Control and 4, everything still looks smooth. Now we got this hanger part on the top, and what we want to do is we want a flat section up there. So in order to get that flat section, there's a couple different ways that we can do this. Probably the easiest is to just extrude a rectangle. We can also use split body. We can make a surface and replace the face or split it. There's a bunch of different ways that we can do this. For me, what I'm going to do is create a sketch. Since everything was based symmetric about the origin, I'm going to start with my line tool. And I'm just going to draw a vertical line, hit the green check mark, and then I'm going to draw a horizontal line. Now, the reason I do this is because I've got a midpoint constraint that can go between these two. I can make sure that my horizontal line is at the middle. And then I want to select this and convert it to construction because all I really need is that horizontal line. So what I want to do is I want to figure out where this needs to be. And I'm just going to put it about right there. And now I've got split body. So the body to split will be the hanger we created. The splitting tool is that sketch. We're going to allow it to extend out. And what this does is it leaves us with two solid bodies. Now we have the original hook up top. We've got this little piece here. And then we've got the main body. And what we've done essentially is we've cut that away. Now, theoretically, we can add a small fillet here. But the problem that you run into with something like this is that you get these little artifacts. You get these areas where it's got this like little section of an extra surface. Now, sometimes you can get away from this by just cutting a little bit deeper or using a smaller fillet. In this case, we're going to have to either use a smaller fillet or cut a bit deeper to get away from that. So I'm going to hit cancel. I'm going to go back to my sketch. And I'm just going to pull this down a little bit deeper and make sure that it does go completely below that corner. Now everything should update. Everything should be fine. And now the fillet hopefully will work a little bit better. So if I pull this down, let's go ahead and try this again. You can see that the reason it's failing is because we're going past the radius of curvature in this corner, but 0.075, that's okay. Some other things to think about if you're making a design like this is you can have a tangent or curvature continuous fillet. Now, curvature continuous fillet will take the curvature of the surrounding geometry, and in this case, a flat top, and it will allow you to have a little bit different of a transition. In this case, it'll be a little bit smoother. If I go back and forth to tangent, you can see how that looks different. So for this example, I'm going to stick with tangent, and I'm just going to say OK. I haven't saved this thing at all, so let's do a quick save before we make any final adjustments. So the last thing that we might want to do to this is, in this case, we might want to create some flats on the bottom. Now, the shape looks pretty cool, but a lot of times you'll see that hangers will have flat sections. Maybe there'll be a bar across to hang pants on or whatever the case might be. So we're going to do this in the same method. We're going to create a sketch. I'm going to take a look at my first sketch. You can see that the original lines that we used, we kind of changed the shape a little bit, but that was only for guidance. But I'm going to follow the same procedure. So I'm going to do a horizontal line. I'm going to snap this horizontal line's midpoint to the origin. And then I'm going to use this to create my triangle. So I'm going to hit escape to get off my constraint. I'm going to find where that hits. I'm going to turn this into construction since I don't need it. And then I'm going to create a line that comes up vertical to the origin, and then there'll be a line down here that's going to be parallel or collinear to this one. So what I'm looking to do is to make sure that it cuts all the way through the solid. Now, once I have that, this vertical line can be construction, which is X on the keyboard, and then I'm just going to mirror these two lines to the other side. And what I can do is I can use this as a split tool, but right now with the mirror, I can move it around. I can drag this out to the side a little bit and figure out where I want that angle, if I want this to be up a little bit higher, and just sort of play around with the shape until I'm happy. When I'm happy, we're going to finish the sketch. We're going to once again do split body. We're going to split the hanger, use this as our split tool, and then we should have a body for the bottom. Now, once we're done with these bodies, we can select them and we can right click and remove them. We want to make sure we don't delete them because we can't delete them because the references will also get deleted. Now, some interesting things happen here. First, we want to make sure that we fill at the center. We want it to be rounded, and we can kind of do this visually based on the angle that we have here. That looks pretty good. But the other thing that we need to be aware of is the transition that happens in these corners is going to be the limit to our fillet. So if I try to fillet this and I begin just dragging it, you can see that we instantly get some issues. Now, oftentimes those issues are around just the fillet size, and you can see Fusion is thinking really hard. It's trying to see if it can figure out a way, but part of the problem comes because when you start dragging this arrow, the scale is pretty big relative to whatever fillet size you're trying to do. You can see right now it's trying to solve a 3.5 radius fillet. If I instead do something like 0.01, you can see that it's fine. And what I suggest when you get to a complex design like this is that you manually increase that value and figure out what size fillet is going to be okay for you. You're going to get to a point where it's going to fail. You can see 0.13 is okay, 0.14 it fails. Now, if you want to have a variable fillet, now what you can do now that you know this number, this is sort of the minimum that happens probably in this corner right here, you can change the fillet type from constant to variable, and you can begin to add some points. So in this corner, we want to make sure that these are 0.13 or 0.12. And this point right here, I'll do 0.12. And then this one up here can be a bit larger. So if we want to go larger up here, we can do that. Now we will have to make sure that we come over here and also do the other 0.12 to make sure that we are limiting that fillet in those corners. And we'll do 0.12 here. But what that allows us to do is it allows us to pick up on these different spots, have a larger fillet so it blends a bit better, and then we can decrease it in the corners that are the problem. Now, obviously, the best option is for you to figure out those transitions and those shapes in the form body. But oftentimes when you need to have something that's perfectly flat, so like in this case, we might need something that is truly flat, that is really not reasonable in the form. We can do it. We can use the flatten tool, but it has to be up against a creased edge to even have any kind of chance of being flat. Now, it's usually not the best option. And in this case, using a tool like split body with a sketch after the fact is going to be the best way. But you can see here that the transitions are going to cause problems in these corners, and these are going to be your limitations. Obviously, the 1/2 inch fillet up here is pretty big, and that's fine. But down here in these tighter corners, this is where you're going to run into your issues. I think that's as far as I want to go with this. We can take a quick look at rendering. And I also want to note that there is an appearance. So I'm going to hit A on the keyboard. When you go into the appearances in Fusion 360, under wood, there's an option called a solid wood. Now, solid wood is actually pretty interesting because what this lets you do is it lets you cut away from your model and the grain of the wood will be carried into the design. So this allows us to see the grain, how it would happen if we were to actually cut through the model. So this is a pretty neat way to get a design like this if you're going to have this cut out of wood, to have it sort of mimic real life. So those 3D finished woods are pretty cool. And you will notice again that they do show properly as you're cutting through solid geometry. So if you ever wondered what that was, that's kind of the case. They do also have really realistic bump maps on them. So you can kind of see inside of here, it does really look like the grain of the wood, and it gives you a realistic touch. I'm going to do a quick render on this. I'm going to change the background to environment. And under my environments, I'm going to use the photo booth. This will give me a good light. I can also increase this. I'm going to go to maybe 1500, give it a bit brighter, make the cherry pop a bit. And I'm going to flatten the ground. It'll give it a little bit of a lighter texture. Flattening the ground is going to take the HDR image, which is going to be somewhat of a sphere, and it's going to flatten the ground portion of it. Now, typically what that does is it'll distort where the ground plane meets the rest of the HDR image. So if you're in something like Crossroads or the Plaza, for example, you'll notice a big difference where the plaza is going to meet the buildings. So you can kind of see back here, if we turn off flattened ground, you can see where the ground plane is really supposed to be. The sidewalk is there, but you can see the gutters that are coming down. And as soon as we flatten the ground, it is essentially cutting off a portion of that depending on the scale. And the further we get away, if you're rendering a big object, it obviously looks quite a bit worse. And I'm going to double click on this, bring it back in view. But that's something that you really notice if you are dealing with a scene that has a true HDR image. The photo booth and any of those studio type scenes, you don't notice it because it's all grays and sort of whites. One thing you can also do is instead of showing the background, you can show a solid color. We could make this perfectly white. And then all we really need to contend with is the lighting. There's not going to be a reflection of the plaza because we're dealing with a wood. You're not going to actually see any of the reflection. All you're getting is the highlights from the sun. If I were to do this, I would likely turn off the ground plane altogether so we don't see a shadow. And you do need to consider whatever metal you're using. In this case, it's kind of like a matte steel by default. So you're not going to see the reflection of the plaza. You can kind of see it here. If you do get in real close, you can kind of tell. But those are things that you should be mindful of if you're trying to create a render. This looks pretty good. We can go ahead and fire off a render of this, but that's going to be the end of this sort of practice video. At this point, we've practiced forms on quite a bit. I always kind of think we've hit the end of what we can do with this, but I always get another question. So we've covered a golf club, we've covered a clothes hanger, we've done earbuds, we've done a helmet, we've done obviously tons of different car parts. If there's something else that you're trying to model with this, there are also a few things that I've been doing for clients that I won't mention here, but they're totally outside of cars and all the other things that we've done. But if there's something else that you're having trouble with, please leave it in the comments. Let me know. If I can cover it, I certainly will try. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.